The music in the main house prevented them from hearing Terry's frenzied screams. They had the stereo turned up, and Mark and Jeff sat at the table, locked in an arm-wrestling combat as the girls watched and cheered them on. "Come on," said Vicky, sitting close to Mark and urging him on. "Come on, Mark." Both boys were grimacing as their arms wavered first one way and then the other, but it was clear that Mark was stronger. As Jeff started to weaken, he grunted in exasperation and used his other arm to pull Mark's arm down. Both boys laughed. "Cheater," said Vicky, grinning at him. "2 out of 3, said Jeff, flexing his fingers. Sandra sidled up to him and bumped him with her hip. "Jeff, don't wear yourself out," she said in a low, husky voice. "You want to wrestle? Come with me." She pulled him to the couch. Jeff required no coaxing. He sat down and pulled her into his lap. Her arms went around his neck, and their lips met in a long, passionate kiss. Vicky watched them for a moment, then leaned close to Mark and spoke in his ear. "You want to take me on?" she said softly. Mark wasn't sure how to respond to her. Just looking at her was enough to make his heart start hammering away inside his chest. But he didn't want to leave himself open to being hurt again. Some girls just flirted with him to be kind. He'd had more than his share of that sort of kindness. He had feelings too, and just because he was confined to a wheelchair didn't mean he couldn't feel normal male desires. "Okay, have a seat," he said. He smiled and put his arm up. "I only want your fingers," Vicky said, her eyes staring deeply into his. He raised his eyebrows. "What?" She produced 3 little electronic games and laid them on the table. "Take your pick," she said, smiling. "They're Ted's. It's okay with him." Mark picked up the little boxes one at a time, examining them. Football? Hockey? Baseball? He glanced at Vicky. What was happening here? He asked himself. Was it only his imagination, or was this incredibly gorgeous girl actually coming on to him? "What's your pleasure?" he said, trying to keep his voice level. "The one with the puck," she said, slyly. Mark cleared his throat. "You mean hockey?" She stared at him innocently. "Is that what you call it?" Mark flushed slightly, not certain if she was flirting with him or teasing him. "Jesus, girl, don't do this to me," he thought. "Don't rattle my chain. It isn't fair." "What do we play for?" he asked. Vicky moved a little closer to him and smiled seductively. "Position," she said, looking straight into his eyes. As they played, Sandra broke the long kiss with Jeff and slowly got up to her feet. She reached out for Jeff's hand and, smiling, led him up the stairs. Mark and Vicky watched them go and exchanged knowing glances. "Your turn," Vicky said, handing the computer game to Mark. Their hands touched briefly as she passed the game to him, and she felt the electricity in the brief contact. "3 goals or you're gonna lose," she said, looking directly into his eyes, saying things with her expression that she was not saying with words. "I've heard that one before," said Mark, taking the game and punching the small buttons. Was it possible that he wasn't just imagining this? He was really getting turned on. He'd been attracted to her from the first moment they met. Could it be that she felt the same way, too? As he played with the computer, Vicky started to roll a joint. She glanced at him, intent on the small screen, and for a moment she hesitated, not sure how to bring the subject up. Then she took a deep breath and decided. What the hell? Just come right out with it. "Mark," she said, not looking at him, making it seem merely a casual question. "What happened that you have to be in a chair?" "Motorcycle accident," he said simply. "Paralyzed my legs." Vicky swallowed nervously. "Is it permanent?" "Doctors think so," Mark said. "I don't." He glanced at her. "I don't intend to be in this thing the rest of my life," he said firmly. Vicky pinched the ends of the joint. She touched her tongue to her upper lip. "Just your legs, huh?" she said in an offhand manner. She hesitated, then took the plunge. "Everything else okay?" Mark understood her meaning. "Oh, I do all right," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "One way or another." She smiled. "Toke?" she said, holding out the joint. He shook his head. "I'm in training, remember?" "For what?" she said, giving him a level stare. Upstairs, Jeff lay back in bed, tooting on his harmonica, smiling and watching as Sandra slowly unbuttoned her tight shorts and eased them down over her hips, smiling seductively and maintaining direct eye contact with him all the time. She ran her tongue lightly over her teeth and crawled on top of him, pushing up his shirt and kissing his stomach softly. She slipped his shirt off over his head and put her arms around him, pulling him close as they kissed, their tongues tasting each other. Then she pulled off her blouse and pressed up against him, lightly running her tongue across his parted lips, feeling the moistness between her legs as her nipples grew hard against his bare, smooth chest. Mark put down the computer game, having failed to score enough goals to beat Vicky. He conceded defeat with a sigh. "What does the winner get?" said Vicky in a low and husky voice as she looked deep into his eyes. "What does the winner want?" Mark asked her. She stared at him, her eyes sending smoldering messages. "Guess," she said softly, leaning forward and kissing him gently on the lips, once, twice, then slipping her tongue into his mouth. After a moment, she drew back. "Want to stay together tonight?" she whispered. "I was just about to ask you," Mark said huskily. Vicky smiled. "My cabin or yours?" "Ted's in mine," said Mark, thinking that the last thing he needed was to have Ted coming back late and walking in on them. "I don't think that would work out." Vicky put out the joint. "We've got the whole camp," she said. "We'll find our own cabin." She stood up. "Just give me a few minutes to get some things, okay?" "Sure," he said, swallowing hard, hardly able to believe that this was really happening to him. She bent down and gave him a quick kiss. "I'll be right back," she promised in a whisper. She went outside and hurried down the path back to her cabin, humming to herself happily. She had been so afraid that things might not work out between them, that Mark, because of his injuries, might not be able to make love, or that he would take her coming on to him as a show of pity, or worse still, as some sort of perverse desire on her part to have an unusual sexual experience. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, she was more than a little nervous about spending the night with him. She had never made love with a handicapped person before. She had no idea what to do. She guessed she'd just have to be on top. But beyond that, she really wasn't certain how to go about it. Was there anything she might inadvertently do that could hurt him in any way? She was sure Mark would take charge and tell her what to do. But she just didn't want to seem awkward with him. She wanted it to be right between them. She ran up the stairs to her cabin and went inside. After flicking on the light, she briefly checked herself in the mirror, then went over to the dresser and took out a fresh blouse. She slipped out of her halter and into the blouse, then rummaged through the drawer in which she kept her panties until she found the ones she was looking for. A pair of sheer black silk bikini panties. She held them up and smiled. She dropped her jeans and stepped out of them, then quickly changed her panties, putting on the black ones that felt so good against her skin. She walked over to the bathroom and took her perfume out of her travel bag. She sprayed a small amount of the perfume onto her wrists, the backs of her ears, the nape of her neck, the cleft between her breasts, and, finally, with a salacious grin, she struck the bottle inside her panties and gave herself a squirt for good measure. Leaning over the dresser, closer to the mirror, she turned her head to either side, examining her face. She raked her fingers through her hair, checked the results, and made a face. She rummaged in the travel bag once more, then looked around on top of the dresser. In the drawers. No luck. She couldn't find her hairbrush in the bathroom either. She tried to think where she might have left it. Snapping her fingers, she ran out to her car, which was parked just outside. She opened the door and stuck her head inside, looking around on the front seats and in the glove compartment. She sighed, getting frustrated, and then she thought to look underneath the seat. When her fingers closed around the handle of a plastic hairbrush, she withdrew it triumphantly. "There you are," she said, holding it up. A rumble of thunder caused her to look up at the sky. Dark clouds were scuttling across the moon. It was about to start pouring. It certainly wouldn't do to go to all the trouble of fixing herself up only to have the rain come down as she was on her way back. She'd walk in looking like a wet cat. She'd have to hurry. She hoped Mark wasn't getting too impatient. Mark sat alone downstairs in the main house, listening to the sounds of Jeff and Sandra making love upstairs. The radio was off and the house was very still. He could hear Sandra giggling upstairs. He smiled. It seemed that everyone was pairing off. Jeff and Sandra, Scott and Terry, Paul and Ginny, and now Vicky and himself. Poor Ted. It looked as if he was going to get left out in the cold, but maybe he'd find someone in town. Mark certainly hoped so. He knew what it was like to feel lonely. He wondered what was keeping Vicky. She was probably nervous. He hoped she hadn't gotten cold feet and changed her mind. It wasn't easy trying to get a girl to like you when you were stuck in a wheelchair. Sometimes it wasn't easy getting people to respond to you at all. They were either too responsive, Mark thought, going out of their way to be helpful and often interfering in the process, or they simply treated you like some sort of helpless infant who could not fend for himself. And there were some people who were so disturbed by the idea of someone who was handicapped that they acted as if they didn't even see you. He didn't know what was worse, being pitied and condescended to, or being ignored. Vicky wasn't like that. At first he had thought she might be one of those girls with a really strong maternal instinct, someone who saw him as an object of pity and wanted to mother him. But he had clearly misjudged her. She had offered to push his chair just once, and when he had insisted upon doing it himself, she had backed off immediately. In fact, he realized that he had unintentionally hurt her feelings. He had seen the expression on her face out of the corner of his eye, and he had winced inwardly at his own insensitivity. There had been no need for him to be so abrupt with her. He could have thanked her for her well-meaning intentions. He could have smiled. But she had realized instinctively that he was touchy about accepting help from other people, and she had not held it against him. Instead, she had gone out of her way to try to get to know him. When she looked at him, she didn't see a wheelchair. She saw a guy who just happened to be in one. He heard what sounded like a footstep on the porch stairs, and he swiveled his chair around. "Vicky?" he said anxiously. He hoped it wasn't the others coming back. He didn't want anything to spoil it. He wheeled himself over to the front door. It sounded as if someone was standing out there, not certain about coming in. "Vicky? Is that you?" he said. He reached out and opened the door, shoved it hard, and rolled his chair out onto the front porch. He looked around. There didn't appear to be anybody there. It was dark, and the black clouds rolled across the full moon. The wind was getting stronger. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Lightning flashed upon the bright steel blade as it swished through the air and thudded into Mark's face, slicing through flesh and crunching through bone in one unbelievably powerful stroke. Mark never knew what hit him. He never even had a chance to cry out. He was already dead as the wheelchair rolled backward from the impact of the savage blow, tilting and then crashing down the stairs. His body lay completely still in a tangled heap at the foot of the porch steps, and then it was slowly dragged away, leaving behind a smeared trail of blood, unnoticeable in the darkness. The slow tread of the heavy work boots made the porch steps creak ominously as he climbed them, but the sound of the whistling wind and the rolling thunder drowned out his approach. He reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. Lightning flashed as it opened soundlessly, casting his giant shadow on the door and letting a brief gust of wind come into the living room before the door swung shut behind him. He looked around. The dying embers of a fire were glowing in the hearth. A few empty beer bottles and a bowl of popcorn were on the table, along with several computer games. A girl's embroidered denim jacket was laying on the couch. A chessboard was laid out on the coffee table, the pieces still left in the same position as they'd been at the conclusion of the last game. A crude, Indian-style wooden spear, tipped with iron, was leaning against the wall over by the stairs. A grotesque rubber monster mask hanging from it. He crossed the room and reached out for the rubber mask, which he removed from the spear and dropped onto the floor. He picked up the spear and felt its heft. It felt strong. The point, hand chiseled from a stone and shaped like a large arrowhead, was firmly lashed to the wooden shaft. It would not break loose. He closed his fingers around the long shaft of the spear, almost caressing it. The sound of muffled laughter, followed by a high-pitched squeal of delight, came from the second floor. He turned and with a grim purpose started slowly climbing up the stairs. Halfway up, one of the steps creaked loudly, and he paused, hesitating, listening intently, but the sounds of lovemaking continued uninterrupted, and he resumed his climb, holding the spear before him. The roaring in his ears sounded like a cataract, as if a huge wall of water were tumbling down from a great height and crashing down upon a pile of jagged rocks below. He could not block out the sound, no matter what he did. There was no escaping it. He could hammer his head against a tree until it bled. He could pound his fists against the ground until the skin broke and his knuckle bones protruded, as if he could batter the very earth into submission. He could run blindly through the forest, tripping over roots, crashing through the underbrush, his hands clamped over his ears in a futile effort to shut out the sound. All to no avail. No matter what he did, the roaring sound would threaten to engulf him, and there was only one thing that could make it go away: blood. Over the horrific pounding in his ears, the tidal waves of noise that slammed away at him relentlessly, a disembodied voice seemed to float up from the depths of his subconscious, a voice that he remembered only very dimly. It was the voice that had spoken to him while he lay in a wooden crib. It was the only voice that had ever spoken to him kindly. His mother's voice. "Kill them, Jason," it commanded him. "Kill them. Kill them all." He knew them. He knew them all. He knew they were to blame for what had happened to his mother. He knew that the only way he could make the relentless pounding in his head diminish was to sacrifice their lives to the dark forces that threatened to consume him. He moved closer to the door that stood ajar, the door to the bedroom where Jeff and Sandra were making love, oblivious to the horror that approached them. She lay beneath him, her arms clasped tightly around his shoulders, feeling the strong muscles in his back as he drove himself deep inside her, pulling his hips back and driving them forward rhythmically, filling her with a warm, liquid heat that pulsed through her in waves. Sandra felt his hot breath against her neck. She felt Jeff's lips brushing against her throat, the tip of his tongue flicking at her earlobe, and her unfocused stare took in a diffused image of the curly blonde locks of his hair that brushed against her face as she hugged him close, making him a part of her. She felt the tremors start from way down in the tips of her toes, building in waves to a feeling that engulfed her, sending her entire body into paroxysms of ecstasy as she felt the heat of passion washing over her. She hugged Jeff to her with all her might, trying to force him into her more deeply. And then the shadow crossed her face, and her gaze focused on the figure standing over them, the horrifying hooded apparition that held the spear aloft, the burning, hate-filled eyes that bored directly into hers. She opened her mouth to scream, and then the spear plunged down, plowing through Jeff's back so hard that she felt the brutal impact as the spear penetrated clean through him, then into her own flesh. She heard the hiss of air rushing from Jeff's lungs. She saw the shocked, disbelieving expression on his face. She felt the spray of blood that came out of his mouth and struck her cheek. She felt the searing heat of the spear's iron point tearing through her flesh, plunging through her body, and emerging out the other side. It was driven through them both with such incredible force that it continued on through the mattress of the bed and became embedded in the floor. Sandra did not die right away. She writhed in unendurable agony, transfixed by the spear, which united her with Jeff forever in a passionate embrace of death. Blood bubbled up from her lungs and frothed upon her lips. She tried to scream, but found herself choking on her own life fluids. She saw Jeff's sightless eyes like frozen marbles gazing down at her in a glazed stare, and the last image that registered on her conscious mind was the terrifying sight of Jason Voorhees standing over them, clenching and unclenching his fists, staring down at them with utter loathing. She wiggled like a fish impaled on a hook, feeling her life ebbing with every blood-frothed breath she took. She wanted to scream out loud in protest that this could not possibly be happening to her, that she was too young to die, that she had a right to live. But death cared about neither age nor rights, and in a moment it was all over for her as darkness closed in upon her, and she moved no more.